Hey folks, welcome. Tonight I am going to be putting these ground control camber plates on my F87 M2. And for those of you who are asking, why are you putting ground control? I thought you vastly preferred Vorshlag in my camber plates overview video. You're absolutely right. I do prefer Vorshlag. And I do put my money where my mouth is. I've had a set of their brand new camber plates, their newest design, which came out about this May, so a couple months ago, on order for the past couple weeks. And unfortunately, they're not going to be ready in time for my next track day. So I'm going to have to make do with these in the meantime. So if you are someone that has purchased a set of used ground control camber plates, like I have, there are some things that you really need to inspect on this before you just go ahead and throw it on the car. And one of those is this silver top ring here. I don't know why ground control decided to make this metal pretty weak, and so as a result what happens is where the aluminum strut brace mounts on these 3 bolts here, it ends up pulling up this silver ring, and it bends it. So if I show you really closely here, you can kind of see right here, this metal ring is pulled up right where this stud is. And if we look at this side too, you can see the exact same thing happened on this stud. So this ring is now a little bit deformed. You can try and put this thing in a bench vise to correct it, but to be quite honest with you, it's just going to deform again once you put it in your own car. So yeah, one of the things I'm really not happy about with the ground control design. The other thing you want to check is this metal plate right here, and this is what will let you move these 2 screws to these holes up here to get the enhanced or the further camber adjustment range. And ground control actually supplies a little plastic piece that goes in there to support this. Well, at least most of the time you'll find that. Sometimes you'll get a camber plate that doesn't have it. But anyhow, you can tell if a previous owner didn't put that support piece in there because that plate will be bent like this one, right? So obviously what happened is whoever installed one of these before didn't put those plastic supports under there, and so when they tightened these screws, it just bowed and bent this plate. And another reason why that happens is because ground control doesn't have a torque spec for these screws. I called them and I asked, I said, what is the torque spec for these screws? You give me a torque spec for these, but you don't give me one for these which actually control the camber adjustment slider. And they said, yeah, we looked at our engineering documents, there's no torque spec, just get them hand tight. So who knows exactly what that means. I'm very confident that some people really just crank them down because, well, who wants their camber sliding adjustment to move? Okay, so I've found an interesting issue with this set of ground control camber plates, and I'm going to illustrate it by putting this spring perch onto the bottom mount, right? So this just is supposed to slide on there, right? But if you look at it, you can see that's not even, is it? It's not flat. The right side is a little bit lifted up more than the left. And the reason why that is if we take a look at these screw channels for the top bolts, well, you can clearly see this one right here is protruding past this base here. Now, I do have the appropriate washer underneath, and I did check the length of these screws compared to all the rest of the ones in the kit, and they're all the same length. And so what that means is this washer is not thick enough compared to this plate over here, and it's causing the screw to protrude through the bottom. So it means I need to find another washer to shim this a little bit higher up so that this is actually clamping over here and it's not pushing on the thrust bearing. So if your thrust bearing isn't rotating at all, it's probably because this screw is acting like a set screw into it. And this is not going to be a problem if you're in the high camber adjustment range, because then this screw will be back here. So all of them will be with the appropriate thickness washer, but this is just kind of silly. Okay, so now I've gone ahead and put some thicker washers on there, and here's an example of one. This is actually courtesy of my spare Millway camber plates kit. And so I've got the ground control washer on the right and the Millway on the left. You can see how quite how much thicker the Millway one is. But anyhow, you can clearly see on this camber plate that now none of those bolts are protruding above that base. So when I go ahead and I put the spring perch on, it now sits flat. And the last thing you're going to want to check is the thrust bearing itself. So if you listen to this one, I hope you can hear that because it feels awfully gritty, because it is. This design lets a bunch of dirt, grime, and whatnot into this bearing. On the stock spring perch version right here, you still use the OE dust boot, so that helps a lot. But this design just isn't very good. It isn't very well sealed, and I have never, ever, ever, ever seen a set of ground control camber plates that were used that didn't have grittiness in the bearing. And you can see, look, it doesn't spin very easily. So if you're like me and you've bought a set of used camber plates, take a look at them, inspect them before you just go throw them on the car to make sure they're really in the condition that you want. You know, these thrust bearings, they can be replaced. They're just like a E46 thrust bearing, I believe it is. Ground control will charge you something like 25, 30 bucks for one of them, and I think you can get them for like 15 to 20 online normally. Another thing to check is make sure you have the top nut for the strut that you want. I asked ground control about buying a spare set of them, and they wanted $30 per nut. Kind of ridiculous in my opinion. Vorshlag will only charge you $12.50 for them. So anyways, that's enough ranting about these used plates. Let's go throw them on the car. Okay, so let's start taking apart things in the engine bay while the car's on the ground. And the reason why I like to do that is just it's at a more convenient working height, unless you're like really, really, really tall. So anyways, we need to remove these covers on each side. And as you can see, there are three 10mm cams. So we're going to go ahead and turn those cams 90 degrees. Don't torque it too hard because you can accidentally break the plastic stops and then you won't know which way your cam is really facing. And then over here on the side of that cover, we have an expanding rivet, so you need to use a forked trim tool to kind of pull up the center stud. And once you pull up the center stud, then you can pull out the base. Then we can go ahead and pull this cover up and out. Next, we're going to remove all of the various, expanding plastic rivets on this rubber top cover here. So go ahead and take your forked trim tool again and remove all of those. And for the expanding rivet over here on the side, you can see I've actually just taken my pry trim tool and gone in from the front underneath the rubber piece to go ahead and get that. Now we can go ahead and remove this rubber piece, and you can see it just kind of pulls it up, and you can remove it completely or you can just kind of put it off to the side here. It doesn't really matter. If you have an electronic suspension, there'll be a plug coming out of here, so now it's the time when you would go and you disconnect that plug. Be a little bit careful with it because sometimes they can be a little delicate, and it's kind of a pain if you manage to break the internal wiring or connector. So now I'm going to go ahead and just get brake torque on the nut that holds the damper to the top mount. And so I'm going to stick my 10mm wrench in there, and I've got the pass-through 18mm on top. And I'm just going to break that torque so that's easier to unscrew later. Now we don't want to unscrew that nut all the way just yet. We just want to get the brake torque on it so that it's easier to unscrew later when the car is off the ground. Next, we're going to work on removing the carbon and aluminum strut braces on this, and the reason why you need to do that is because the aluminum brace covers some of the bolts on the top of the right side or passenger side strut tower. So we're going to start by removing the 13mm bolts that secure the carbon brace. And then there's also a 10mm bolt over here connecting the brace to this coolant tank. Then we can go ahead and get the carbon brace out of the way. Then we can go ahead and remove the three little plastic push rivets on this piece here. And then we can go ahead and take that piece out, and that will reveal the side of the aluminum strut brace. Then we can take our E14 and remove this side bolt. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take my E12 and I'm going to remove these three bolts connecting the aluminum strut brace to the top mount. Some of the M3 and M4s could also have 13mm bolts instead. Now, as you can see, I can lift this up quite a bit, enough to get a wrench and the socket I need in there to remove these bolts. So I'll leave it up to you whether or not you want to go ahead and remove this brace entirely, or if you just want to get it to this point here. If you do want to remove the aluminum brace all the way, we're going to have to start by popping off these covers here. And that will expose two 16mm bolts to remove. Then on the driver's or left side, we have one more 10mm bolt that we have to remove, connecting this bracket to the aluminum strut brace. Now that everything has been disconnected from the aluminum strut brace, we can go ahead and remove it. I'm going to remove it over here on the passenger side because I don't want the aluminum strut brace to accidentally touch the positive battery terminal here, just in case. So we got to move this out of the way. Get this up, and then we can pull it out. Now let's send the car up. Now we can go ahead and take our wheels off, so grab your 17mm and make sure you're applying some pressure on the bottom of the wheel when you do your last bolt so it doesn't come off. You can go ahead and take the wheel off. So we're going to start by undoing the end link right here, and to do that you need a 16mm pass-through and a T30 counter hold. So you can see I've got a 16mm on a extension, as well as my T30, so I'm going to get that T30 started. Then I'm going to get the 16mm on there, and then I'm just going to unscrew this. And you can do this with an impact as well. If you want to just put the impact on the counter hold, and you can just spin that, or you can do it this way and spin the nut. Now we can pop the end link out, and we'll just set it to the side in front here, out of the way. Next, we'll want to unclip these wires from this bracket here so that we can let the strut articulate or move out when we move it out of the way. Next, I'm going to place a jack underneath the rotor to support the knuckle and strut assembly. Then you can go ahead and take your 18mm pass-through and your 10mm counter hold and undo the top strut nut. And if you didn't put a jack underneath that knuckle, this is the point where you would see that strut go whoop, just drop through the hole and come crashing down as far as the arm travel below will let it go. But since we have a jack, this is staying nice and put. And so now we will go ahead and lower that jack a bit to release the strut. So we're lowering the strut just enough so that we can kind of move it over to the side a little bit and leave the shock tower area clear. Now you can go ahead and grab your 13mm if you have the 5-volt top hat version. I believe if you only had 3 bolts it was a 16mm, but anyhow we can go ahead and remove all but one of these. And when you get to this last bolt, you'll want to take your other hand, reach underneath the wheel well so that you can support the camber plate when you remove that final bolt. Now you can just push down on the camber plate and take it out of the bottom. You can see as we move the strut out of the way, there's plenty of room for that to come on out. Additionally, you can see I've got this gasket here, this green bluish looking gasket, and it stayed attached to the top mount. If it stays there, great. Sometimes that likes to come out with the top mount itself. If it does, then we'll just have to remember to transfer it over to the camber plate. So one thing I was curious about was whether the stack height between the OE and the ground control top mounts was the same. And so when I measured the thickness of the OE one from the bottom spring perch to the top of the top mount, it was 25mm thick, and on the ground control it was 23mm. So it's very close, not quite, but at the end of the day 2mm really shouldn't matter. So let's talk about setting up the ground control camber plate before you install it. As you can see, I have this in the low camber position, so I've got the 2 screws up front over here, each with a washer between the screw and the aluminum main body of the camber plate. In the back I've got this larger brace plate, and I've got 2 more screws in these rearmost holes, and then this camber adjustment is slid all the way that way. until it rests up against the body of the camber plate. The reason why I'm setting it here is because this is the 0 adjustment position, which means it should be the same as stock. And we don't want to change this until we get to the alignment place, unless you happen to be able to do alignment at home, which in that case, good for you, man. You can also see I've removed all of the nuts from the studs that secure it to the shock tower, as well as the studs that will go to the brace later. And if you have that gasket, go ahead and put it on here if it's not still stuck to the shock tower. At this point, we can go ahead and move this rubber dust boot up over the bottom so that we can get to the bump stop. And actually what we can do is we can just pull this entire thing out up the top and then pull the original bump stop out, because ground control gives us their own to put in there. And if you look at the stock bump stop and see how that would interface here, it doesn't fit, right? It sits on this lip right here, versus the ground control one fits nicely in the center in this little pocket on the thrust bearing piece. You'll also notice that the ground control one is quite a bit shorter than the OE one, and if you take them and you squeeze them, the ground control one is a bit stiffer. And the stock bump stop is about 70 millimeters long, and the ground control run is only about 52. So you'll get quite a bit more travel, which may end up making the ride more comfortable. Okay, so here is the ground control bump stop that we have to put on, and if you look at the hole here, you'll notice it's a lot smaller than the stock bump stops hole. And you know, when I measured this, it was 19 millimeters ID, and the shock shaft is like 23 millimeters OD. So at first I thought I had the wrong bump stop, but I called ground control and they said, no, this is in fact the right one, and you really just have to force it over the shock shaft. So when you're putting this on, just be aware that it's not going to be the easiest. You're going to have to force it over this thing. I've heard of some people even trying to use grease on them, but anyways, just go ahead and get this bump stop on. Also, if we're looking at the bump stop, the nose portion of it, this is the part that should be facing downwards towards the shock, and the flatter base should be up top facing the camber plate. Now that the bump stop is on the shock shaft, let's go ahead and we'll take the camber plate and we'll go ahead and put it into the car. Make sure you're using the right side. Once again, right, it says it's marked right here. This one says driver's side front is this way, which it is, so we know it's the right orientation. I'm going to reach underneath and get this camber plate into position. And once again, you know, I don't have the gasket on mine because the gasket is stuck to the shock tower. So if your gasket came off or you decided to take it off separately, make sure that it's on the camber plate. And then I'm just going to go ahead and take one of these nuts and get it started threaded on here so that the plate will stay up and not fall down. Then go ahead and take the 4 other nuts and just get them hand tight on here to start. And what I want to do is, you know, since this is supposed to have this sliding caster adjustment here, you can see I'm moving the plate fore and aft, but really this is going to be limited by the aluminum strut brace. So I want to take it such that the camber plate is nice and perfectly centered in the shock tower. So right, you have the silver ring, which is, you know, would be perfectly concentric with the shock tower lip right here. And then I'm just going to kind of keep things in place because I don't want to impart any caster out of the normal neutral position. Then I'll just, you know, make sure these nuts are like snug, hand tight. I'm doing it just with my hands. And then we can go ahead and put the strut in. Now that the top is done, let's go ahead and make sure everything is good down here. We want to make sure the end of our coil spring is up against the stop on the spring isolator. You also probably want to make sure that this dust boot is pulled down, right? Right now it's kind of up, but it should be sitting around this lip down here. So I'm going to go ahead and set that. And then we can go ahead and move the spring into position Up top on the rubber dust boot, right, we are reusing this rubber dust boot. There is also another stop, and here, let me rotate the spring, and I'll show you that. So you can see on this dust boot up here, there's this stop on it where the spring up here will need to go up against, so I need to make sure that that's properly placed, and it is. So I need to make sure that these stay together as I put the spring back into position. And we can maneuver the strut into place and begin jacking up the strut assembly. And make sure that the spring seats against the spring perch. And then keeping one hand down below underneath the camber plate on the strut, I want to keep it aligned as I jack it up so that you can see the shock shaft goes through the monoball on the camber plate and comes up. Next, I'm going to take the top nut, get that threaded on, and once again reach down below and kind of push the shock shaft such that it's centered within the monoball, and I can turn the top nut and see that it's going into the monoball. So that's telling me that everything is nice and centered. Then we'll go back under, jack up the strut until the spring has a good amount of load on it. And we want to do that so that there's upward pressure on the camber plate and everything is fully sat against the shock tower. Then we can go ahead and take our torque wrench with a 13mm socket for these nuts, and I'm going to torque these to 15 foot-pounds, and I'm going to do so in a star pattern. So it's going to be 1, then 2, 3, 4, 5. Now we can take a 19mm pass-through and a 10mm counter hold and go ahead and secure that strut nut till it goes all the way down. Now go ahead and adjust your jack if you need to, so that we can take the end link and insert it back into the mount. And then we'll take the 16mm nut and put that back on. Then we can get our T30 counter hold, 16mm pass through, and tighten this nut back up. And then this will get torqued to 56 Newton meters or 41 foot-pounds. If for some reason you're unlucky and you can't just torque this with a socket and the ball joint keeps spinning, you may have to do something funky like here, where I've got the T30 counter hold still in there, and then I've got my torque wrench with a crow's foot on the pass-through socket. If you do it this way, make sure that crow's foot is 90 degrees from the head or handle of your torque wrench. Otherwise, the torque you have set on the torque wrench will not actually be the torque applied. Then we're free to go ahead and lower the jack and remove it. Next, don't forget to re-secure all of the wiring inside the wheel well.
Now we can go ahead and put our wheels back on. Don't forget to apply a little bit of pressure on the bottom just so it's not going to tilt and come off. And then we'll go ahead and grab our 17mm with the bolts and put them in a star pattern, but we're not going to torque them to final torque just yet. Alright, with the wheel on, you can go ahead and lower the car, or if you're just working on one corner, go ahead and lower just that corner of it.
Okay, now that we have both camber plates secure in the shock tower mount, it's time to put the aluminum strut brace back. And one thing I'm going to do on this right passenger side is I'm going to take that rubber dust cover, and what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to get this part of it over the brace, because well, all the things over here, they kind of get in the way and make it hard to tuck it in nice and neat later. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that now. And now with that done, then we can go ahead and maneuver the brace back into position. And I'm doing this over from the passenger side because we have this positive power terminal over here. And well, we don't want the brace to touch that. So here I got to lift up this flap in the middle to kind of get that part down and under. And we'll align it with all the mounts and get it over the posts in the camber plate. And then I'll go to the left or driver's side, do the same over here. Now that the brace is back in place, the first bolts we'll want to put back are the 16mm ones at the center. Then we can go ahead and take our torque wrench and torque these bolts to 56 Newton meters or 41 foot-pounds.
Now we can go ahead and take that protective cap for the center bolts, go ahead and put that back in place. Be careful not to drop it because it kind of sucks if this goes all the way down to the bottom of your engine bay.
So let's go ahead and put in this E14 bolt, and let's just get this down and snug by hand first. Then we can take 3 of the 13mm ground control nuts and get those started on their posts.
Okay, now that we have the aluminum brace on and we've put in this side bolt, let's go ahead and torque this bolt to 34 Newton meters or 25 foot-pounds. If you have an M3 or M4, you probably have another small bolt back here, and you'll want to torque that one to 28 Newton meters or 21 foot-pounds. Now we can fasten the 3 nuts that secure the aluminum brace to the camber plate itself, and these are the same size nuts as the nuts on the studs that mount the camber plate to the shock tower. So we'll go ahead and torque those to 15 foot-pounds. Now we can put the carbon fiber strut brace back. So we'll take it, slide it, under that gasket cover thing that we put on, and align all of the screw holes. And if we look at the bolts that go into the carbon fiber strut brace, you see we have the short ones and the long ones. The short bolts will go into the front and the long ones in the rear. Alright, now that all of our bolts are in, we can go ahead and grab the 13mm and torque wrench again, and we will be torquing all of these bolts to 28 Newton meters or 21 foot-pounds. And BMW wants us to torque the frontmost bolts first and then move our way rearwards. Don't forget to attach the coolant tank to the carbon fiber strut brace, so go ahead and grab that 10mm bolt, go and put it in, and then this just needs to get tightened to hand tight, snug. And then we have another 10mm on this bracket that secures the coolant tank to the strut brace, so go ahead and get the little peg or arm into its appropriate hole, and then go ahead and put that 10mm bolt in there, and once again this one just gets tightened to hand tight, snug. Alright, now that the car's on the ground, this post should be sticking all the way up, so now's the right time to go ahead and grab your torque wrench. For this ground control, it's going to be a 19mm, and then we're going to go ahead and torque this, and this gets torqued to 71 Newton meters or 52 foot-pounds. It can be pretty difficult, so if you can't get there all the way, don't worry about it, but do get it tight.
Then if you have a EDC or electronic damper connector, go ahead and hook that up. And afterwards, we can go ahead and take the rubber cover and place that back over. And then insert the 3 plastic pins back into this guy. Make sure to get any side pins like this one down here. Next, we can put in the side molding and put the 3 plastic push pins in. And then don't forget your side cover. Get that into place. And then we'll use our 10mm to turn the 3 cams 90 degrees so that the arrows on them match or line up. And then if there are any side holes for push pins like this one here, go ahead and get that in place. And then lastly, don't forget to torque your wheel bolts to 140 Newton meters or 104 foot-pounds in a star pattern.